Good evening. Tonight marks the first proper night of NavRatri, the 9 nights of Goddess Durga. In order to help explain just what we're celebrating, I'm going through reading the commentaries we have previously prepared on each of the NavaDurga aspects of the great goddess. So tonight, as it is the first night, and we operate in a North Indian tradition, Shailaputri, first of the NavaDurga. The first night of NavRatri is dedicated to Ma as Shailaputri, the daughter of the mountain. As noted in the introductory reading, the mountain in question refers to King Himavat, the lord of the Himalayas and father of Parvati, daughter of the mountain. That's Parvati obviously being a feminine diminutive of Parvat, which means mountain, so you can see how that works. The daughter of the mountain in this particular cycle of her incarnation, I should say. However, I shall also advance a rather intriguing alternate linguistic theory, which would perhaps situate her more clearly within the overarching mythic cycle as the reincarnation of Lady Sati. But more upon that later. Now, if you have just joined us, and have come from a more Abrahamic perspective upon theology, you are no doubt wondering how it is that a god can die. Or, for that matter, perhaps more astoundingly, be quite literally, mythologically speaking, reborn. These are fair questions, albeit with full answers well beyond the scope of this piece. Suffice to say that the previous incarnation of Parvati was rendered deceased, at least directly, by her own hand, casting herself upon the pyre of the most inauspicious, not least in the sense of there pointedly being no Shiva there, auspiciousness himself, horse sacrifice being carried out by her father, Daksha. Yet rather frequently in Hindu mythology, death is not the end. In fact, for many figures of note, it is only the beginning. So it is with Parvati, whereby, not least because of the eternal nature of Shakti, the feminine connoted power, which both precedes, transcends, and even outlasts and ultimately unmakes the universe, a reincarnation was perhaps going to be inevitable. Not, of course, that this assuaged the grief of Mahadev upon learning of his beloved's rather incandescent mortality impairment. With the eminent foresight that one would unquestionably expect from the Maharani, the one who has the most eminent claim to the title of Chakravartin, as she is the axis around which the wheel of Mundi truly turns, Parvati therefore managed to be reborn in the court of King Himavat and Mina, or Minavat, daughter of Mount Meru, the latter, according to some myths, having previously been a retainer of Lady Sati, and in this light granted a particular boon of giving birth to a very specific daughter. This was fortuitous for 2 reasons. First, Himavat proved to be a far less conceited and much more reasonable figure than had been Daksha. But second, just as the Himalayas is known as the Devabhumi, the land of the gods, the deeper Himalayas were especially favoured by Lord Shiva as a retreat, and following his recoiling from the world after what had happened with Lady Sati, he had retired to them to lead the existence of a renunciate ascetic, his only distractions from the unutterable pain of losing his other half being the austerities and cannabis, and perhaps the natural beauty of this most radiantly inhospitable setting. Uma's appearance here in the Himalayas, then, can clearly have been no accident, although I have no doubt that no matter where they are, or who and how they wind up, the divine couple will nevertheless find their way back to each other. Indeed, even the end of the universe, the death of time itself, is not enough to keep them apart for long. But to turn back to Shailaputri for a moment, this is, after all, supposed to be her piece. If Lady Sati represents an exemplar of married womanhood, unfortunately with all of the evidently potentially lethal contradictions which such a role can entail, then Shailaputri is somewhat at the opposite end of the spectrum, being the maid of the mountains, young, unmarried, and setting out into the world upward in search of her destiny. This mirrors the path of the devotee, the neophyte, who is just beginning their journey toward greater illumination and empowerment, and for whom much of the world is seen with the exhilarating glittering of fresh and unjaded eyes. In all senses, then, she is pristine. The very close connection between her and the mountains, the earth, also connotes her role as a figure rather akin to Mother Nature, the princess of the mountains, and therefore in implicit command of all the natural phenomena, and such to be found within her and her father's domain, but also, as we shall see, nature far more broadly afield, as symbolized cosmologically via the positioning of the mountains at the center of creation. And indeed, Meru, who would therefore be regarded as Shailaputri's maternal grandfather, is one of the key axis mundi in Hindu mythic geography, from whence radiates out all, particularly in the form of rivers, the slow movement of glaciers and agglomeration of eroded material from them out into the broader world. In a certain sense, then, all that is around us is ultimately derived from the mountains, in one way or another. And just as the seabed fossils, still to be found amidst the highest peaks of the Himalayas, demonstrate, for this was once the now Akashic ocean of Tethys in the far distant past when dinosaurs still roamed, to the mountains they may somewhat inevitably return. Even, come to think of it, should they slide under the crust of the earth via subduction zone to be spurted forth once more through volcanism activity. The mythic situation of Shailaputri, then, standing freshly reformed, following the terminus of a previous span of existence in most dread fire and destruction, for such surely we must regard the apparition of Virabhadra, and in some tellings Bhadrakali too, amidst the Pajian tree of Daksha's folly, following her self-immolation thereupon, resonates most strongly with what has just been said about physical as well as mythic geography and plate tectonics, as it connotes a return to the center from outside margins, there to begin the helicase ascent toward the heavens, where the absolute most truly lies, as we shall see with tomorrow night's piece on Ma as Brahmacharini, the ascending seeker of the absolute. This final goal, having been elucidated somewhat in my introductory piece, and effectively, after a sort, presenting as the reunification, the re-realization, the remembrance of the ascending maid and then mother of the mountains, with the perfect status of Siddhi-Datri, as one of Shakti's highest forms here within this realm. Indeed, one can also trace out a not entirely dissimilar arc of reascent when considering the example of Lord Hanuman in the Ramayana, wherein Bajrangbali is consigned to earth and stripped of his cities in order to allow him to progress back up toward full godhood. I am oversimplifying and using slightly askew theological terminology here for a non-specialist audience, via the sanskara of positively imprinted experience that can reshape his ethical nature and personality back towards the light. It also, helpfully and handily, displays a very different approach to the concept of moksha than an array of Vaishnava and Buddhist philosophies would put forward, insofar as the liberation thusly entailed does not mean sublimation and dissolution, but rather unfettering. An understanding which is definitely supported in the ancient Upanishadic metaphors around the chains of karma being loosened, entailing and enabling complete freedom of action. Just what we would expect from the all-powerful, indeed Ari-powerful, Ma Shakti. What I have said also chimes in rather intriguingly with that aforementioned alternative linguistic speculation I had thought upon when researching this piece. You see, while Sanskrit is capable of being a most eminently precise language when it comes to many religious terms, it is also capable of, in an almost playful way, combining and conflating both the meanings within a word, such as the way in which Kal connotes death and time as well as iron and darkness, as well as previously different words in together. It is not quite accurate to think of these as folk etymologies or false friends, as due to the nature of Sanskrit, these processes tend to reveal previously hidden qualities of the concept or persona being talked about. Now, the fields of meaning for Shaila, which to my surprise and perhaps slight horror, is actually likely etymologically related to the Australian and New Zealand female given name and epithet of Sheila, are not simply concerned with mountains and mountain-related concepts such as stones, including potentially precious stones a la jewels per Pali interpretation, or foundations, and the apex points of the support skeleton of a dwelling from which everything else hangs, but with slight changes in inflection, produce terms for the scarf or veil worn by a married woman, an element which has in common with a comparable, although not directly cognate, Old Norse term, faldir, which has much the same meaning, and which is derived from the visual similarity between head covering and a snow-capped mountain peak, Parvati we might say. Harvesting as well, including, interestingly, of fossils, bringing into the present elements from the very much archaic, indeed verily prehistoric or even primordial past. It can also mean iron, camphor, but also for form, beauty, piety, dispositions, traditions, virtue, and proper conduct. We therefore have both renderings of the modern English term, habit. I suppose you could say then that Shailaputri would also connote, via somewhat homophonic resonance, not only daughter of the mountain, but also the best daughter, the beautiful girl, one born of a line of ancient and emphatically pious conduct. For such, ultimately, is why Sati exited the stage. This too is a well-attested Shaivite Shakta metaphor, that of the god and goddess as supreme actors, dancers or singers in the cosmic plane. And in the Shakta incarnation / expression lineage is she situated, an exemplar of a daughter and a maid. However, it goes deeper, for there is also the related term Shalap, which refers to a house, a home, a hall, and perhaps more interestingly for our purposes, although Nilaya is the also an attested name and nature of the goddess, Shala derives ultimately from the Proto-Indo-European kel, to cover, to protect, that gives us an array of similar terms in Western Indo-European languages, as well as, in my reckoning, the Kal we see in Kali. This is doubly appropriate, as in addition to the mythic account whereby it is Kali, to whom the consort of Raj Himavat gives birth. We also see here, then, the Kali hidden, another pun, both hidden and concealed, similarly derived from this kel particle, within the outwardly perhaps more innocuous exterior of Ma Shailaputri. Although it be vastly overreaching to infer a daughter of death, except in symbolic terms as a reference to the reincarnation and its reasoning for occurrence. Or would I? For there is also the Shula term, which, while nominally, or should I say nominatively, derived from a different root, slightly different root, works out as referring to a peak, a point, a sharpness, and therefore an instrument of wounding, whether a weapon, now that's whether both in terms of W-H-E-T-H-E-R, as well as whether W-E-A-T-H-E-R. So you might say it's a hailing, in terms also of the, hail obviously, as found out by the most unfortunate fate of the skeletal travellers at Rupkund, neath the triple mountains of Trishul, which is surely aptly named here. That's literally the name of the mountain in question. It's quite a remarkable situation. Or an instrument of justice, an axis about which a corpse's body of criminality is to be found. Not that I am necessarily seeking to imply that the world at large is a criminal, except if we are talking about the Nordic cosmogonic myth of Ymir. And in an abstract sense, sorrow, grief, and pain. The dual connotations there, then, would be of a child of suffering, which is clearly evocative, once again, of the regrettably literal self-sacrifice of Sati, which gave rise to Shailaputri in the first instance, but also via the focus upon the point, the peak of the mountain, the tip of the spear, further supports the regality of her, as well as connecting back to the supremely well-armed nature of the goddess in the vast majority of her aspects, forms, and incarnations. And with what I have just said about a spear further in mind, the most excellent insignia of both Shiva and Shakti, in the form of the Trishula, which additionally connotes Samarajya over the three worlds, with each of its three supremely sharp tips, as well as the flensing power to discern and dissect truth from illusion, as the supreme deities are enjoined to do. Yet even these were not what initially caught my eye, and turned my hand to spelunking amidst etymologically sound mythography. Rather, it was by chance stumbling upon an array of very similar terms in non-Sanskrit languages, including the sila in Serbian, force, power, strength, and violence. Also apparently how the Force of Star Wars fame is translated in that language, with close cognates in other Slavic and some Romance languages, as well as terms in the Baltic languages which refer idiomatically to new growth upon a previously barren area of land. The rather more direct rendering would be of a coniferous forest or on a sandbar. And it is worth noting the strong linkage of even the term coniferous, fir tree, to the mountain queen Indo-European divinity detailed in my previous Bharat Mata article, amongst further conceptual linkages between the goddess in question and sylvic or forest/tree life. Perhaps this even forms a branching point of sorts with the wild woodland goddesses so prominent in Romano-Greek myth, and with a hypothesized chain of derivation, wherein the word for the barren land in question would previously have meant an area burned, the saliency of which is strikingly, electrifyingly obvious given the previous phase in the Sati-Shakti mythic cycle. The scale root in question, entirely unsurprisingly, also providing us with the modern English terms of skull and skeleton. Perhaps that which is uncovered, revealed, when the outwardly obscuring form is peeled, hence the cattle saliency, which fits most aptly with both the iconographic depictions of many of the more wrathful forms of Devi, wherein she is frequently bedecked with mundamala, a garland or necklace of skulls, often carrying a kapala, a skull cup, from which she may drink, equipped with a katvanga, a skull staff, and even, in some cases, quite directly, has a skull visage, as is the case particularly with Chamunda. This also clearly produces a nexus of associations with the cremation grounds, wherein Kali dwelleth, as both a burning place and one wherein the corpses of the deceased and consequent illusions are burned away, leaving skeletons, skulls, or simply earth and ash, vibhuti. But to bring things back once more to Ma Shailaputri and the circumstances of her incarnation, it would also connote that out there in the Akashic background of the term, we are a daughter of the Paya, going forward the notion of fresh new life, wilderness even, springing up from what was once previously dry and desiccated, dead land or desert. This then handily illustrates both the path of Ma Shailaputri, springing forth from Deva station, for such was the ruin of the palace and the sacrifice of Daksha, following Lady Sati's self-immolation, and the consequent rage of Rudra via Virabhadra Itkar, into desolation, for such was the state of the heart of Shiva, following the death of his beloved. The universe howled with grief and rage, for they are the universe. and to it bringing with her new life, new love, the re-enchantment of the world, but also with the implicit connotations of the restoration and reinvigoration of tradition and piety, as well as the sincere support of violence and rulership with which this grand mission, a figurative translation indeed for Dharma Yuddha, this being suitably tied to our broader work in that field via the Devi Bhagavatam and the key situation of Durga therein, may be upheld. And the shadow understanding of that contained within and intrinsic to this new beginning is also the ultimate end, indeed the ekpyrosis, the pralaya, the funeral pyre for all creation, and thus the cycle goes on, around again, periodically becoming renewed, the ascendings, emissaries from the axis about which the universe truly turns. As noted beforehand, exactly that connoted by the mountain, and the daughter therefrom. Shailaputri, we might say. That which is old, the mountain, is new again, the daughter. That which is fixed and great and eternal, appears also in our midst as a young maiden. And that which was thought lost forever has a weird, indeed a weird in the archaic Germanic sense, way of finding its way back to us, given enough time. From small beginnings, perhaps akin in multiple senses to a pebble, that comes down a mountainside one night, great things, avalanches indeed, can be sprung. And contained within that pebble is the very essence of mountainhood itself. Thus is the lesson of Shailaputri to the devotee, that as the divine willpower is the most mighty force in the universe. Indeed, in a certain sense, this is partially what is meant by the connection of Shakti and Prakriti. Essence, which renders Purusha operational and mobile rather than mere, again in multiple senses, matter. Well, it is good indeed to begin as you mean to continue. Sometimes the best thing for the moment is simply to begin. Iconographically, the customary depictions of Ma Shailaputri tend toward an elegant simplicity. She is generally shown associated with a white bull, Nandiji, this also connoting the conveyance of the seeking devotee upon their destined path of enlightenment, as well as the linkage and increasing proximity to Shiva. Nandi also meaning joy, the opening prayer, particularly of a play or a drama, and other such elements that are eminently appropriate for her early station within the processional of the NavaDurgas. Wielding the Trishula, the meaning of which is discussed above, crowned with the crescent moon, which, as we shall see, grows more full with empowerment, often bearing a lotus flower, with the customary meanings of beauty, purity, blessing, bounteousness, and, as a point of interest, the metaphorical value inherent in the way in which the lotus, an emblem of beauty and divinity, grows from the empty barren earth, therefore connoting a sort of supernally sourced permanence amidst the tumult of oft imperfect material existence. She may also have a hand posed in Abhaya Mudra, connoting blessing, the removal of fear, also helping to signify her role as a guide, and occasionally wearing, as we've noted beforehand, a headscarf. Jai Mata Di. Hail the goddess Shailaputri, first of the NavaDurga.